Welcome back. I'm Tombstone, and this is Tombstone's Takes, where we talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and interesting about books, books, books. And today, we're going to talk about Carrion Comfort, the world's best vampire novel that's actually about a Holocaust survivor, one who wants revenge on a Nazi, but not because the Nazi put him in a concentration camp, but because the Nazi made him play a game of human chess. Today, let's start with a question. What do you do when Stephen King, the master of horror, says Carrion Comfort is one of the 3 greatest horror novels of the 20th century? There's only one thing to do. You ignore him for years and years. Let's rewind a minute and start at the beginning. My first job when I was 16 was shelving books at the local library. For 4 hours a shift, I would put books on a cart, take them to the shelves, and shelve the books over and over and over. It wasn't the funnest job in the world. I hated shelving books, but I loved finding new ones. So I got to know the books in the collection at our local branch. I saw their covers over and over and over again, and one particular cover struck me. That cover depicted a skeletal-looking woman with big eyes and hair standing on end as if she'd been hit by lightning. Intrigued, I read the jacket copy. Being inquisitive, I asked friends and other readers, "What's this book about?" And I found out. It was about mind vampires. Mind vampires. And man, that sounded stupid. Oh, yes, you heard me right. Mind vampires. That was the term people used. Mind vampires. Man, that sounded so dumb to me. Especially at 16. To me, I was asking questions like, what does a mind vampire really feast on? Typically, when you think of vampires, you think about them drinking blood or some other physical substance that feeds them so that they can have some kind of long or immortal life. But what is the mind? The mind isn't a brain. It's not something that you can actually clamp onto, get your fangs into, and drain from people. So what was it about these vampires where they were actually being sustained by someone's mind? It's not like the mind is the brain. And if people like to eat brains, then wouldn't that kind of put them in the camp of a zombie? I think that those things were cutting rather close to each other. And so when people told me, hey, this book is about mind vampires, I kind of was like, that's stupid. And I shrugged it off. So if that book came across my cart and I need to reshelve it, that's what I would do. I would reshelve it again and again for years, never bothering to pick it up and read it. Well, if you're here, we can make a couple assumptions. First off, you can assume that I eventually read the book, which I did. But what was it that changed my mind? Over the years, I learned a few things about what I do in order to choose books to read. I don't read cover blurbs or jacket copy, and I don't read reviews of books before I read them. I find that both things kind of spoil my interest in the book. So what is it that I actually do in order to choose to read a book? Well, I kind of do this. Grab the book, open it up to the first page, and I start reading. Well, I picked up Carrion Comfort. I started reading, and the next few minutes I found myself intrigued. Next thing I know, I was entrenched and reading the book. And that's how I find that I read most books today. If I think something might be interesting, I pick it up off the shelf and I start to read. If I find it intriguing, funny, interesting, emotional, I keep reading. And this book, Carrion Comfort, interested me to no end. In this book, I found Saul Lasky and Melanie Fuller, two truly intriguing characters. In their story, I learned a few things about what this book is about. First, I found some creatures who look and appear human, but they have the ability to control other people with their minds. I found that these creatures, they're all addicts, and forcing people to do what they want and commit acts of violence are their fix. And the third thing I found is that the regular people who know about these creatures obviously want to stop them. They want to stop the violence from continuing to happen. But as you continue to read the story, you soon realize that these regular people almost have no chance whatsoever of succeeding. Somewhere in those three details about the book, you have all the trappings for a good story. You have interesting characters who are placed in impossible circumstances and overcoming in the end. Isn't this, at its core, what a good story is about? But let me remind you, at its core, this is a horror story, and Dan Simmons, the author, constantly keeps the twists and the terrors coming. Simmons' main character, Saul Lasky, is the Holocaust survivor I talked about at the beginning. He's the one that we see first encounters the mind vampires in 1942, and he spends all the years after World War II up until the 80s searching for these mind vampires and for a way to exterminate them. 40 years later, these mind vampires have emerged from hiding, so to speak, and he catches wind of them, and when he does, he finds himself engaged with way more mind vampires than he ever imagined. He also finds Natalie Preston, a young photography student who, for reasons of her own, hate these mind vampires. And if I say mind vampires one more time, when you hear it, even now, just the term mind vampires sounds so outrageous and impossible. Now, to be fair, these creatures are vampires in the sense that as they control their subjects and as they put them through violent situations, these vampires do feed off of the vitality of the human life that they're subjugating to their control. And if they control them long enough, excuse me, these people who have been subjugated lose all essence of who they really are. What I found by reading the book, instead of dismissing the premise as stupid or dumb, was indeed one of the most disturbing books that I've ever read. In some cases, some people might not find what happens in the book as scary. They might term it more as disturbing. This isn't a typical horror story in where you have spooky sounds in the night and maybe slashers who jump out of the dark with a knife ready to kill the final girl. Instead, the book at times reads more like a Tom Clancy or a spy novel because of the ability for these creatures to control anybody at any time and at any place. And so these creatures have infiltrated all levels of society, whether it's the government or religious organizations or just high society at large. And those creatures then, from their various positions, begin to control and manipulate the whole scale of life where they live. Now, Dan Simmons in the book creates a frighteningly realistic vision and exploration of violence through control. He expresses what he was trying to do in the introduction to this book. Let me read a quote from it. Mind vampires feed on violence, but the ultimate violence for them is the imposition of their will over yours. I long ago discovered that such an exercise of will and control of one person over another is a form of violence, and one we can all gain an unholy taste for if we're allowed to. Now, Dan Simmons' novel shows exactly what happens when people become addicted to violence and control. We can see through the book and through the situations and scenarios that he presents us with exactly how things of the Holocaust could have happened, maybe even slavery historically in the United States. It's no surprise that there are racial undertones to the book, especially with the history of World War II and slavery in the United States, and how violence and control impacts society at large. So those things do have an undertone in the book, and it's something that Simmons explores really well. And you do end up, as you're reading it, rooting for some characters who you don't believe can actually win. In the creation of this novel, Dan Simmons might have written a book that's even more relevant today than it was when it was first released in 1989. Now, many of the book's faults come from the fact that there are some long, drawn-out action sequences that seem to reflect a lot of the entertainment of the 80s. So if you really liked the spy novels of the 80s, or if you liked action movies like Die Hard or any of the Arnold Schwarzenegger films, they do have those kinds of action sequences in it. This book is a tome. It's like this edition, I should say, is like 767 pages, which with really tiny print. So in other editions, the book is well over 1,000 pages. And so there are times when some of those action sequences are drawn out and could have been edited well. However, there's a lot going on, and Dan Simmons uses every opportunity for that to not only explore his character's motivations, but to show us with each introduction of each new villain how dastardly and despicable they could be. It's truly amazing that Dan Simmons wrote this 767-page novel by hand. One of the things that he was doing when he wrote the book was he was a teacher. He had created some classes for some gifted students, and he would teach during the day, and then he would come home and he would write by hand on those yellow legal pads, the book. And then he had hired an assistant who would type up the novel. Now, this novel almost didn't make it into print. The initial publishing company that he had a contract with, they had bought the book, and then that publishing company was going out of business, so he found ways to buy the rights to his book back. And then it was later published through a different publisher. So at first, this book went through a tenuous history on whether or not it would be made. But after it comes out, if you read it, it truly deserves the praise that Stephen King gave it. So for those of you who get scared easily, tread lightly. I know it might sound like a joke that I said that this is the best vampire novel ever about a Holocaust survivor who wanted revenge on a Nazi, but not because the Nazi put him in a concentration camp, but because the Nazi made him play with a game of human chess. And that sounds kind of ridiculous when you say it out loud. However, when you read it, there's nothing ridiculous about this book. And it is terrifying. And for those of you, I don't do this very often, but for those of you who need content warnings, CWs, This has got a content warning on it for everything. For everything. Yeah, this one gets CWs for everything. Now, in the end, the villains are just as despicable as the good guys are good. I enjoyed the book. I would say a little bit more, but I just think it's one that if you're even interested in reading it at all, do what I did, pick it up, start at the first page, and start reading. I know you're going to have a good time. And with that, I appreciate you. Appreciate you staying till the end. If you like what I do, please like and subscribe. And thanks for watching.